Trail and ultra runners, welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I'm your host, Coach Jason Koop, and on this episode of the podcast, I have biomechanics researcher and coach Max Paquette. Max is an associate professor at the University of Memphis, and he recently produced a series of papers all about training load and the different ways we can track and inform training using these different types of training load. Most trail runners will track miles and they'll track vertical in order to determine training volume. But tracking training, particularly for trail runners, should not be limited to strictly tracking volume. Trail runners should also be tracking training load, of which there are several different flavors, and they all attempt to quantify not only the training volume, like miles and vertical, but also the intensity of training into a value or score. These systems range from Bannister's TRIMP system, which is a heart rate and a time-based system, Training Peak's training stress score, which I use a lot, and Strava's relative effort, which is formerly known as suffer score. But tracking training load is not as simple as it appears to be. Cardiovascular load is different than musculoskeletal load. Running 10 kilometers hard is markedly different than running 10 kilometers easy, even though the mileage is exactly the same. So we dig into all of this in this interview, and I have to say I learned a lot, and I hope you do too. So let's get right into it. Here's my conversation with Max Paquette. One of the reasons I wanted to get together with you is because you are a scientist, you're a researcher, but you're also a coach. And I always find the people who can blend both of those worlds really fascinating, right? Because it's not everybody that can do it. We meet coaches that don't have a good grip on sports science, and we meet people in the research field or in academia that just can't figure out how to work with athletes or make it translatable to athletes. So the ones that do both, I always have a keen kind of interest in. How did you fall into that dual role, just from you personally?
Well, yeah, I was a runner at the University of Guelph in Canada, and I ran a bunch, and I just loved running. And while I was a runner, though, I was always interested in both the science behind training and injuries and things like that, and then of course also the science and the art behind coaching. And so I always picked my coach's brains about coaching. Why we're doing these workouts? Why are we doing them at this time of year? And then what was the science behind the decisions? And then when I got more into science, I was with my professors. Okay, why would a coach make you do this, or why would an athlete want to do this at this? So just trying to kind of marry everything together, and that I think just asking those questions over time sort of really leads to more questions, as you know, and then you're like, well, maybe I could study these things. And when I finished my master's degree, I wasn't sure I wanted to do a PhD, but then when I realized I'm from Canada originally, and in Canada, it's pretty rare for people to be able to focus solely on running, science as their primary research area, just because of the funding modules and expectations, funding model, sorry. And then, but then I realized in the US, there are lots of sports science or, exercise science programs, PhD level, and biomechanics focus, physiology focus. So I went down the biomechanics path, which turns out, in addition to physiology, really works well with coaching, especially from an injury standpoint, but also from a monitoring of training standpoint. So then I got really deep into the biomechanics stuff, and then I almost got to a point where I was feeling out of touch with the real world, if you will, right? Like, we're doing this in-depth analyses, these fancy models and this and that. And I kept thinking back to my running coaching background and thinking, this is really hard to translate to a coach, right? And it's not like science always has to translate to coaching and application, but that didn't make me happy in that I wanted to do research that could then be, discussed with the coach and how to apply that to daily training and return to running or rehab and so on and so forth. So that's kind of how it got me. That's what got me where I am. That kind of process.
You mentioned this this aspect that we're going to jump right into it and just cut out all the normal chit chat
Yeah,
of
I like it.
asking questions, and then those open up more questions and those open up more questions. Cause you
Yeah,
don't know what you don't know. Right. And every time you
yeah,
go down one of those things, it seems like a rabbit hole. And one of the things I was really keen to talk to you about is this piece of commentary that you produced along with Chris Napier, Richard Willey, and Trent Stellingworth. And it's all about quantifying training load. And
yeah.
I went through the same thing. I was a runner, right? We're all runners. And the first thing you do when you're a runner and you get a training log is you start logging miles
Mm-hmm.
as a quantification of
Yep.
training volume, right?
Right.
And
Exactly.
and since that time, this notion of training load has started to come to the forefront. And I feel like it's been this like golden goose in running, cycling, and triathlon that coaches are trying to ever elusively chase. Like, how high can they push their training load, what the right type is, what the acute to chronic ratio is in order to, predict or prevent injury and all these other things. And you produce this really insightful piece of commentary that kind of tore apart training load in this way that I had always thought about, but I couldn't as eloquently put it into words as you did. So what was the genesis of that? And then we're going to go down and talk about the different ways that we can actually quantify training load.
Oh, well, thanks for the kind comment about the eloquence of the commentary. But yeah, I mean, the reason for it is what you just described. Is just, everybody does it. Everybody does mileage, right? And that's one of the things I always asked about was, why are we so caught up and obsessed with mileage? I mean, what does it mean from a mechanical standpoint, from a physiological standpoint? And the answers I always got from coaches was always, well, you need to run mileage to be better. And, or you need to run X amount of miles to be able to run whatever, right? It was always about mileage and thresholds and specific targets. And it didn't make sense to me because I kept seeing runners, distance runners, so like 5K to longer basically, or 10K longer. Some people would run, a ton of miles and be good. Others would run a ton of miles and not be good and not improve, or be tired and beat up, and vice versa, right? Some would run 40 miles, 30 miles and be really good. And others would run 30, 40 miles and not be good, not have enough. So it was clear to me that, mileage wasn't it. It wasn't the predictor of performance. And I think because of the history of sports science and training monitoring across the world in various sports, so team sports, cycling, basically any sport you can think of, and any task, so like pitching, for example, in baseball, cricket, bowling, for example, all these different sports, soccer, football, lacrosse, so on, rugby. The concept of training load has been used for, since the, probably 50s, 60s. It really kind of came into prominence in the science world in the 60s, 70s with Carl Foster and Eric Bannister. But it's trickled into endurance sports. Rowing has been one that has used training loads for decades. Cycling has been using different measures and just distance, right? So in cycling, obviously it's about wattage all the time. People are obsessed with wattage. So we could have that conversation separately. But in the last probably 15 years, there's probably been more discussion around training load and RPE, and including heart rate and other measures to quantify running. I think one of the things that's important to think about is, a lot of coaches, so you mentioned, coaches are chasing this, and I'm not sure coaches in general are chasing this. I think it's being sort of forced down their throats. Mm. And as a result, coaches have to sort of react to that and like, okay, what do I do with this? I need to figure this out. I need to make it work. Right. And I think the way that it's marketed or pushed out is not quite that useful, or at least it's intimidating to a lot of coaches. You got to use training impulse or TSS or this or that, and acute chronic workload ratios and all that. but without justification, typically, right? So the whole point of this commentary was to really kind of step back and give some context as to what's going on, why it's important to do this, and provide some examples and comparisons of, if you only do this, here's what you're missing, right? And that was the whole purpose of it. And then we since then published two new experimental sets of data on this, exactly comparing, week to week changes in recreational runners, and then recently in high school runners. So that's, we wanted to just kind of change the thinking, or at least contribute to the change of thinking, and primarily focused on North American coaches. I do want to say that, Aussies, Brits, Europeans have been using these metrics in terms of endurance sports and running as well. Probably a lot more than North Americans. And because I get a lot of comments from Euro coaches and Aussies, like, we've been doing this forever. Like, what's the big deal? Right? I was like, no, I agree. But spend enough time at a US track meet and you're going to hear the same thing all over again. How much mileage do you run? All these same things. So it was really targeting those North American based coaches.
And when you mention that, I kind of go back to some of the original, some of the original ways of doing this. You mentioned Bannister's TRIMP score, and also training stress score, which was developed by Andy Coggan and Joe Friel. And I had this really insightful conversation with Joe Friel not too long ago that I had just remembered. And he said point blank, if I knew now how training stress score, which is a way to monitor training load, if I knew now how training stress score would be adulterated into what it has been as this end all be all of training, I would have set it up completely differently. And his point, coming from a triathlon and a cycling background, was that his model and the TRIMP's model was using what I would describe as cardiovascular load as this dominant force. But that's essentially what you're saying, is it's not just the cardiovascular load. There are all of these other components. So let's roll through. First off, let's go through TRIMPs and TSS first, and then we'll kind of roll through these other variants of load that we can start to peel apart.
Yeah. I mean, all these different measures. So TRIMPs and TSS are measures of training load, and they all operate in the same concept, which is you're combining some measure of external load, and think of external load as factors that would contribute to the forces being applied to the body, right? So mileage would be an external load. Minutes would be an external load, because the idea is that if you spend more time doing something, you're being exposed to more loading, right? Just logically. Things like, step count. Things like, you could have more, fancier metrics or estimations of force, accumulated force, impact or shock-based measures. And I use these terms loosely, but typically acceleration-based, right? So axial or along some segment, typically the tibia or the heel, peak amount of acceleration. Those are all measures of external load, right? Pace is another measure of external load, right? And then those are combined with measures of internal or physiological load, or as you mentioned, could be considered cardiovascular load, right? So heart rate's really, really, really popular, right? Because nowadays, a lot of the good watches actually have the heart rate monitor on the wrist, which means you don't need a heart rate monitor around your chest. Then we have more fancy measurements like blood lactate, for example, and then all these actual physiological bloodborne type things. And then there's the more simple approach, which is rate of perceived effort, or RPE. And that's a measure of internal load, because you're rating how you feel. And the way you feel, it's not just, I feel great today, it's a beautiful day, it's nice out, I feel happy, right? It's more so about how what you're perceiving your effort is while you work out. And that encompasses sort of like sleep, any type of daily stresses, or life stresses like family issues, finances, work, all these things, relationships, and also, how hard you're working, Like we all know, like we all have different thresholds, right? Like I know my threshold. Okay, if I feel this way, and I can't really describe it, but if I feel this way, I'm like, okay, I'm going too hard. I'm going to slow down, right? That can be hard to quantify with using fancy tools, right? Because we all have our own limits, right? So RPE is great that way because, first of all, it's specific to the person, and people use it a lot to measure internal load. And people argue that, well, it's subjective. Like a 6 out of 10 is different for you and me, and 100% it's subjective. But it becomes objective when it comes from you and you use it consistently, right? We can't compare our RPEs, but who cares? I don't care to know how my training compares to yours. I want to know how my training compares to me, right? Week in, week out, month in, month out. So that's really the value there. So again, TSS, TRIMP, they all work the same way. It's just combining some measure of external load and a measure of internal physiological or cardiovascular load.
I think for the audience out here that's a little bit more of a lay audience, or they're not in a high performance setting with access to like physiologists and coaches and things like that, the two that they're going to be the most familiar with, and I'm going to go in least familiar to most familiar, is Training Peaks' TSS, of which you've got a few different flavors, right? You can take the TSS, you can take heart rate TSS, run TSS, and things like that. Or what was formerly known as Strava's suffer score, which now they call relative effort. They finally dropped that suffer score moniker after.
I've never heard that before.
Oh yeah, well, Strava's so popular in running circles that it's hard. It's kind of hard to get it. It's hard to get away from it.
Yeah.
And we coach athletes on Training Peaks' platform, so they get access to both of those. But they're inevitably always on Strava anyway, and they always want to know what this number is, like how this number is generated. And when it was called suffer score, it was for sure. I know it's funny because I've had this conversation with the folks at Strava before and after they've made this change. And they're basically, we got too cutesy with the names here. Like we needed to think about this a little bit more. But when it was called suffer score, there was a different, like almost like a badge of honor that was associated with a higher score number. But in any case, all that's doing is just remodeling TRIMPs. It's using heart rate if you're using a heart rate monitor, or it's using power if you're using power meter for cycling, and just assigning a points value to it. But inevitably, in my estimation, and this is where I want you to jump in as well, one of the inherent flaws with having this one number determine training stress, whether it's Training Peaks' side as training stress score or Strava's side using their relative effort, is it's trying to alchemize all of these different things that are going on in the body, all these internal, external loads and things like that, into one singular number. What's the issue with that?
Yeah, if you're trying to, and it's funny, we've had a couple of social Twitter discussions about this. And, if you use a measure of RPE, for example, combined with minutes or duration to calculate training load, is that valuable in terms of predicting injury risk, for example, right? And the answer is probably no, honestly. Same thing with all the other, TSS and TRIMP and all this. I mean, I'm not that familiar with exactly how all the TSS scores. I know there's a lot of TSS scores.
That's true.
I've seen like running, swimming, heart rate, TRIMP, TSS, and as far as I understand, the TRIMP TSS is what I've described, which is an external load, I think pace or distance or something times heart rate, perhaps. And then the other ones I'm not too sure about, but I think the TRIMPs one is probably the more complete. But something like that, which is really a training load score, heart rate times minutes or duration, it doesn't really tell you within an athlete, what that athlete is experiencing from a force standpoint. So biomechanical or cardiovascular, as you discussed. So cardiovascular would be more like the physiological response. Heart rate's great for that. Heart rate in minutes, perfect. From a biomechanical standpoint, or how much force over time an athlete is experiencing, Now you have to know more about how the athlete moves, right? So even if you use minutes or miles for runners, and in the ultra world, and especially ultra trail world, where we all know that any mile is not the same, right? So
100%.
if I go run a mile on one or 50 miles on one course versus 50 miles in a different course, the forces at the same pace, for example, the forces applied to me are completely different, right? So this is where it gets more complicated. And I think the wearable technology world is starting to make some strides in quantifying these biomechanical metrics a bit better for each runner. One of the values that I like quite a bit is step count, number of steps you take. Now, of course, between people, each step doesn't mean the same either, right? But I think it's still better than just mileage or minutes, because if you and I go for a run and you consider cadence, right, steps a minute, well, if you go run 10 miles on a trail and I go run 10 miles on a track, we're going to move so differently. You're going to take more steps on the trail because you'll be out there for longer, one thing, right? And you're going to take shorter steps because you're on the trails, and you don't take long loping strides on the trails because you could basically kill yourself, coming down a cliff or something, or, stepping in a hole or whatever. So, you shorten your step so you take more steps per time period, but also you're going to slow down because you got to run 10 miles on a trail, whereas a track, you can be a bit faster. So now you're spending more time, taking more steps. So with 2 10-mile runs, me on the track, you on the trails, you might take 4,000 more steps than I will on a 10-mile run. And those are things that we can't measure when we only look at 10 miles.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's when I think the biomechanical load becomes interesting. The simple thing is steps, because all our watches give us cadence, and some of the watches give you total step count per run as well.
Yeah, you illustrated this really well in the commentary, and I'll link to the commentary in the show notes, but in particular in table 2, where you took a 10-kilometer run under 3 different conditions: an easy run where you were just fresh, a recovery run where you were really tired, and then 10 by 1K repeats in track spikes. And you tried to, the point with that table, and you can correct me since you're the author, is to really illustrate how all of these different ways that you could track training load were not just different, but could be markedly different in each one of those conditions.
Yeah,
yet
exactly.
If you were just looking at distance, it would all be the same. It'd be 10 kilometers, right?
Yep. So, without knowing any better, you could be a coach, especially like younger coaches or just getting started, and they're just assigning mileage because mileage is convenient, right? If I say go run 4 miles, it's that easy. But within a week, among the different sessions that you complete, 1 mile is often different for a number of reasons, but also between runners. Again, to the example I just gave with you, so that example was different environment, but also different person. And the assumption that every mile is the same is erroneous and could lead to misrepresentation of what's really going on, and as a result, what the adaptation might look like after a training block, for example.
Yeah, I remember when this piece of software called Barada came out. Are you familiar with that at all?
I've heard of it. I haven't used it or really been exposed to much, but yeah.
Yeah, so you know where I'm going with this. So when that came out, I distinctly remember all of our younger coaches who had just gotten into coaching and been coaching for 2 or 3 years. They started gravitating towards it. And the linchpin for the listeners out there that aren't that familiar with it is that it gave you a periodization framework based off of training load and where your athlete's training load currently was and where you wanted it to be 6 months down the road, 9 months down the road, whatever time frame you were working with. And it built up a periodization scheme based on those 2 endpoints. And our younger coaches gravitated towards that because it was a way for them to easily look at an athlete's training program and go, okay, they need to be at, 120 CTL points or however they were defining it 6 months from now. And my point to them was exactly what you were just mentioning. Not all of that load is equal because you're basing it off of one single metric.
Exactly. And that's so important. And the main message for coaches in these 3 papers and that started off the commentary is just that is, consider other things. And I do want to point out that, for coaches who work really closely with athletes, smaller groups of athletes, and have constant communication and sort of back and forth with athletes who basically are able to monitor the athlete without actually using a number, for example, that can be quite or as useful. The issue becomes when you're online coaching or have 40 runners you're meeting with, you can't possibly know how everybody's feeling just by, seeing them every day, or seeing their miles that they post online, if whatever the platform you're using. So, again, I want to point out that a lot of coaches do this very well without numbers, right? It's just little signs that they can pick up on. And I think in the trail world, I think that's even more important because every issue I just mentioned is amplified on the trails.
Yeah.
Because the terrains vary so much, because the intensity of the outcome of a run at a specific pace varies so much. You could do the same 2 runs, the exact same pace on different courses, same distance, and be absolutely trashed after one and not after the other.
Yeah.
Right? Just because of the environment. So I actually think that, again, the trail world, the ultra world this is even more important to use metrics that are individual to you, and not focus on just sort of, black box type approaches that just spits out estimations.
So when I first started getting into coaching trail runners, I still to this day have the hardest time convincing both coaches and athletes to get further and further removed from prescription and analysis of training by miles.
Yep.
And instead just go to time-based. And I lost a lot of like content deals because I wouldn't write training programs because in miles. I would have to do it in time and based on vertical and RPE.
Yep.
Just because of what you mentioned. It was so problematic to say, okay, you're going to run 5 miles and you're going to run 5 miles, but this 5 miles has 2,000 feet of vertical change and this 5 miles has 200 feet of vertical change. Like those are 2 really markedly different things.
Or think of like a wet dirt trail versus a packed down gravel path. You run 10 miles on both of these. If you maintain the speed, your legs are going to be beat after the wet sort of dirt trail versus the packed down, gravel path. So that's what I mean by I've coached people who are like, oh, I did my long run today and the pace was really slow but I always prescribe minutes for longer runs and easy runs because the purpose behind that is, if I say go run 60 minutes or 1 hour, even if you go slow, you'll still be out there for 60 minutes. But if I prescribe 8 miles, which again is no problems with prescribing mileage at times, especially for those who are racing a specific distance over a specific course, like a marathon, for example, like a road marathon. The only issue is that when a person is beat up, like really trashed, and I say go run 8 miles, and then they slow down because they're so tired, they might be out there for 70 minutes, right, as opposed to 60 minutes. So that, to me, that extra 10 minutes to be pounding out there for the extra 10 minutes, which is an extra, almost 2,000 steps. I don't feel there's much value there.
So if we were to let's put our brainstorming hats on, maybe we can get some venture capital funding to do this. There's not a lot of money in what this is going to be, so let's not get our hopes up too much. But let's design a coaching tool and a training log tool specifically for trail and ultra runners.
Yep.
What would the hero metrics be that would be the must-haves within the tool itself that we want every athlete and every coach to prescribe stuff by and track stuff?
Ooh, that's a good question. That's a good discussion. I think, like I said, I think you have to start with prescribing minutes. That's your starting point. I think you want to make sure that from a physiological adaptation standpoint, you want to record RPE, which at this point, this is, Final Surge, Training Peaks, they all do it, right? Strava even does it now.
It's taken them a while to get around to it, though. That's the funny thing. It's the easiest thing to record.
But they don't. I don't know if Strava combines them though. You can report RPE, but I don't think it combines them.
You can. You have to kind of opt into it. And what you can opt into is it will basically take the precedence of heart rate in that relative effort. So previous to that, it would take power and or heart rate, but you can you can force the change and make it RPE.
Right. So for trail runners, though, we know, so obviously from a performance standpoint, a trail runner never bails out of a race because their heart rate's too high. I mean, unless there's some, issue going on, right? The reason why trail racers are limited is because of their legs being absolutely done, right? So we are trying to then quantify, how much mechanical load their bodies is undergoing, right? So in that case, for trail runners, you almost want to use certain measures of biomechanics, right? So shock or, impact of some sort, whether that's using a foot-based accelerometer or an inertial measurement tool that can then give you some measure of, what is the external force or external forces acting on you throughout a training session, and as a result, training block or training week or training cycle, to really kind of figure out, you covered 500 minutes this week, but next week you also have 500 prescribed minutes, but are they going to be similar, right? Are you going to change how you move and as a result load your body more or less, and that then allows the coach to make adjustments moving forward to say, okay, well, look, let's try to figure a strategy to minimize load. So that might mean let's go to a flat training surface or, less treacherous terrain, if you will, to try to give you some time to adapt to that load the last 2 weeks, for example. So I think I would say for trail runners, adding some measure of individualized or specific biomechanical measurement or metric, I think that would be even more useful. I think it's useful for all runners, but particularly useful for trail runners because of that, because it's hard to quantify what a mile means or what a minute means in a trail runner.
Yeah. Can I stop you right there for 1 second? Because I think this is a good point. Is that the ultimate application for the stride units and the run scribed units and things like that? These like, accelerometer pods that are sitting on people's feet right now that now they're trying to bake into the watch, that were initially designed with the promise of delivering, in quotes, running power. Is this biomechanical aspect of it the better utility for those things?
I think 100%. I still don't understand the obsession with power. I really don't.
Yeah, that's another conversation you can have.
I get it from like angular power in cycling, right? That's objective. It's from a physics standpoint, makes sense. In running, it's just I just don't see. I just don't see. I mean, I might be proven wrong. I just don't see the obsession. Why people are so hell bent on making this power a thing. But I do think that load in general, measured from these sensors, can be useful. Yeah. Also, of course, given or assuming that one, they're most importantly, and this is probably an unpopular opinion, but most importantly, more so than validity, that they're reliable.
Right.
Right. I think scientists are hell bent on validity. Which is obviously very useful when you're trying to come up with thresholds of force or, torque or impact, G's or whatever. But when you're trying to quantify changes in training, we're looking for week to week % changes. So as long as the tool is reliable and that they're always going to give you the same metric if there's no changes, that's really what matters, because I care about % changes, right? Like how much more are you doing this week versus last week? I don't really care what the amount of it is, right? The magnitude. I don't care if it's 100 G's versus 2 G's, as long as the week to week change is equivalent. So I can compare the week to weeks, right? So that I think the companies should focus more on that aspect, the reliability, but also marketing it as a monitoring tool, not just for injury, but just from a training standpoint, and for coaches to know how much, external or mechanical load runners are dealing with.
You and I are on the same page with that, because I remember when Stride wasn't even to market yet.
Yep.
I went up there and I was begging and pleading with those guys to not call it running power. and I wasn't the only person that was saying that. I'm not like saying anything that's like super enlightening or I'm trying to make myself sound smart. But I was begging and pleading for them to not market it as a quote unquote running power meter, to do something more along the biomechanical aspects and figuring out load and velocity and things like that. But
yeah,
I didn't get a vote, obviously.
Yeah.
But I totally agree with you. That's the value. So we've got time. We've got biomechanical load is something that trail runners should be monitoring, which is not easy in the current environment. That's not a very easy thing to get a fix on. Outside of having one of those devices, is there anything else a trail runner can do?
Yeah, in terms of monitoring.
Yeah, that particular aspect.
I think. In the absence of a tool that can measure on a daily basis or on a session by session basis, I think there's ways that people can then test, not necessarily lab based, but using tools that might not be that runners might not be able to use on a daily basis, but like you can do some, one or two tests, under different conditions to get an estimate of how it is that you move and what are the forces that your body is experiencing. And then you can kind of use that. To estimate what it is that you're going through based on step count. So for example, if you and I go on the track and run at different paces, right? Slower to faster, let's say 4 different speeds. And we measure the forces, the vertical force that is being applied to the bottom of our feet while we run, right? So you should get a fairly linear increase as you increase speed, right? As you increase speed, you should get a little more force per step. Well, then you can kind of, and that'll be, so the speed would be on the x-axis of a one of those scatter plots from high school, you've got this x-axis, y-axis would be force. And so as you increase speed, it should go up, which makes sense, the faster you run, the more force you're going to experience. Well, you can use that to kind of then figure out for you, at different paces, how much force are you experiencing? So you can then use that on a daily basis, right? If I'm out there running at 8-minute pace, I can kind of look at my own personal curve for force measurement and say, okay, this is where I fit on this curve. And that's about, 3.2 times body weight at this pace, for example. On the trail, it's a bit harder because, inclination and so on and so forth, but you could come up with your own metric of, well, this had X amount of vert, this had this type of surface. So you might be a little less force on a softer surface and a little less force uphill, but more force downhill. Those tend to cancel out if it's a loop, for example. So you start putting those factors together and you might be able to use some 1 or 2 time measurement testing sessions and then using those with your data, with your own wash data. So step count, for example, ultimately trying to estimate what each of your step means, right? Is it 3 times body weight? Is it 5 times body weight? Which would be really high, of course, but it happens in some people.
And from a trail running perspective, we're kind of over obsessed with tracking vert or vertical, which is, if you're not in the trail running world, like you hear the word vert, you kind of get it, but but it's obsessive, I think, in the wrong way. It's obsessive from a targeting standpoint. So I want to do 10,000 feet of vertical. I want to do 20,000 feet of vertical and things like that. Almost like a mileage target. And what you're saying is that that's a component of the biomechanical load, and that might be better utility for tracking that particular training metric.
Yeah, going uphill in general will reduce the amount of force that's being applied to your body, right? But because you change how you run, so when you go uphill, you might run on your toes more. And so that, of course, increases the load on your Achilles tendon or calves. But it does reduce the load on your quads, right? So you can start even like micro managing or micro monitoring muscle groups, right? And this is important in runners coming back from an injury, obviously. So if I'm coming back from like a patellofemoral pain injury, then of course, or patellofemoral injury, I'm looking at reducing loads on my quads, of course. So I might be doing a little more uphill stuff. If I'm coming back from an Achilles or calf injury, I might be minimizing uphill stuff, and so on and so forth. Right. So it's not just the force, but how you're moving that might move the load to your Achilles, to your quads, so on.
Yeah, I've always considered trail and ultra running to have like 4 disciplines, right? It's walking. We call it power hiking because we don't like saying walking.
Yeah, you don't like the term walking, fair enough.
And running on flat level terrain, running uphill and running downhill. Because they're just so different. They're obviously linked by the cardiovascular system, but from a biomechanical standpoint, there's such different forms of locomotion.
Yeah, that might be would be different about a trail running monitoring system is almost quantifying percent of downhill at several paces, and then percent of uphill at several paces, and percent of flat ground, at different paces. I think that obviously changes the load on the body, obviously.
Well, from a training specificity standpoint, I can tell you what I do is I look at a race that an athlete's doing, and I quantify it across those 4 different disciplines, just from a total gross amount. How much time are they going? How much time are they spending running flat level? How much time are they spending running uphill? How much time are they spending running downhill? And then how much time are they spending walking? And I try to match those quote unquote disciplines up as much as possible. It's not, exact or 1-to-1 or whatever. I try to match them up as much as possible, particularly in the last like 2 to 3 months of the whole training cycle.
Yeah. And I think, this always doesn't apply to the track, because on the track it's always flat, but in cross country, same thing. Like a lot of coaches, this course is really hilly, but so people do a lot of uphill running, right? But people tend to miss the mark when they forget about the downhill parts,
because they think it's free.
Yeah, the downhill part is damaging, and I think a lot of people don't understand that running downhill is way more damage than running uphill, especially for the quads, right? And so you almost have to match the amount of uphill running with the amount of downhill running. If you're not ready for it, it can beat you up quite a bit.
Well, it's almost like the cardiovascular and the musculoskeletal loads are inverted. And that's kind of the way that I've always thought about it. Like running uphill, it's a high cardiovascular load and a relatively low musculoskeletal load. And then running downhill, it's almost the opposite. It's a super high musculoskeletal load with a very low cardiovascular load.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. So you have to consider both directions, of course. Right. And typically, I don't know of any courses, unless it's an actual vertical course where you're running up a mountain or down a mountain, out or a point to point. But typically in loop courses, you go up and you come down at some point. You have to. So anyway, that's kind of the way I would look at it for sure. Like yourself.
Okay, so far we've got two things to monitor in our trail and ultra running coaching tool. We're not going to get a lot of venture funding behind this if that's as sophisticated as it gets, because that's what it's all based off of. It might work really well, but it's not very sexy.
Well, I think the biomechanical aspect does cover that downhill uphill stuff, right? So as you go downhill, the biomechanical measurements would go up probably, especially if they're foot based or something like that. But on the way up, they would go down. So you can monitor that based on these, right? So you'd say percent of X amount of force is 30, percent of a lower force is 30, and then the rest is all pretty normal force. So you can kind of use that to guide, almost the force exposure in training, if you will. That might be the fancy, sexy sort of platform or pitch, that you might have.
Yeah. All right. Maybe we'll raise a little bit of money, but from talking to you, Max, I can't help but to think that everybody is doing it at least a little bit wrong. And what I mean by doing it is monitoring training and prescribing training, because I can go to any marathon training group. I can pick up Runner's World or at the freaking 7-Eleven around the corner from me right now. Irrespective of the format, I'm going to find training that's prescribed in miles.
Yep.
And one of the things that I'm hearing from you is that that is so different, or the load that comes as a consequence of those miles is so
Yep.
different depending upon the situation. And we're putting too much emphasis on that one particular metric.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was the whole message, in these papers. And we I think we show enough data now and enough sort of theory behind the concept. And, but it all boils down to this, which is it's never foolproof. Like nothing, no metric, no approach to quantified training is always going to be perfect. Even if you're using something beyond mileage, whether it's TRIMPS or TSS or training loads of different input measures, it's never perfect. And that's where I think coaches need to come to understand that they have to still do the work. You still have to be a coach, and you still have to be perceptive and observant and communicate well, and not just rely on numbers. I mean, that's the biggest mistake. And I think that's where all these tech companies fall apart. The plan is great until you actually have to work with human beings. In theory and practice, it sounds fantastic. But when it comes down to it, you're working with complex, organisms and human beings. And it's not, very few of us are full-time training, and which means very few of us are full-time recovering. And so no amount of training peaks or final surge or Strava or this and that will account for yard work in the afternoon or death in the family or, other psychological issues you're dealing with. Those are the things that the human being aspect and the one-on-one, the relationship between a coach and an athlete is invaluable. And until and I hope that no wearable tech company is marketing their tools as like, this is it. You plug that on, you hit play, and then you get numbers, and you use that, as the holy grail kind of thing, because that's just silly.
Well, the recovery space is inundated with that. I kind of make a little bit of a separation between the training prescription space and the recovery space.
Oh yeah.
But without naming names, there are some players in the recovery space that are labeling whatever they're pitching as the holy grail for recovery, which is obviously a big aspect of everything. But as you mentioned, doesn't take into account, or poorly takes into account at the very best, the life stresses, the death in the family, and things like that.
Yeah. And, so then we take a step back further, and the overarching issue isn't even wearable technology, it's education.
Yep.
Right. People want the instant gratification, the path of least resistance, everybody's an expert, right? That's what people want, and in terms of sport, in the sports science world, whatever sports science might mean for some people, look online. There's a lot of experts in sports science. But what does that mean? Does that mean they spent $100,000 on equipment, and now they have all these data and these tools, and they call themselves sports scientists? The best sports scientists don't need tools. Honestly, sounds crazy, but a lot of it is just talking with athletes and coaches and coming up with solutions that don't necessarily require tech. It's understanding the human body, the physiology, the biomechanics, the skill acquisition, the nutrition. All of that is sports science and can all be done fairly well without tools. So anyway, that's where it gets frustrating because humans want to be expert. They want to have the fancy shiny things that it takes away from what we can do is when we can use our brains and knowledge.
Yeah, the best coaches that I've ever interacted with know how all of the tools and widgets work, and sometimes very intimately so, but end up using very few of them.
Yeah. I think there are many scenarios where you can use a tool to confirm what you believe is happening objectively, but there are more times where you don't need that tool to do that.
100%. So what are you doing in your coaching practice now? How are you prescribing workouts?
Yeah. So my my coaching, I coach mostly like junior level athletes, so like the 20-year-olds and younger, up to like grade 9 and above. I tend to be a firm believer that really intense specific training before high school is not really necessary. So I will work with some kids that are in grade 8, for example, mostly on things like basic strength and multi-directional movements and some mobility, and just helping them, sort of move, in certain ways. I won't say well, because it depends on the person, of course. But in terms of prescription, I'm a big fan of prescribing minutes for the reasons we've already discussed. But also often it's just, daily prescription will be minutes, but I won't use numbers to prescribe efforts. Like I won't say a 2 out of 10. I'll say, okay, I just want you to go, nice and easy today. There's no need to push the pace. Whatever the pace ends up being, that's the outcome, and so be it. But just nice and easy, relaxing, sort of not relaxing, but a fairly smooth and an easy day. And I will use paces sometimes if it's necessary. Like if we're doing track intervals or something, of course, use paces, or at least ranges and paces. And I think that's important. I think once you start prescribing very specific paces, that can have disastrous effects, especially if an athlete's not feeling it that day and they can't hit the paces. Emotionally, that can beat themselves up. So I like to prescribe a fairly large range. Like I remember having an athlete, they were doing 1,000-meter repeats. This is a senior in high school, on a gravel loop around a lake, and I think the range was like 30 seconds. It was like 320 to like 350 or something. Yeah, and the kid's like, what is that? I was like, well,
those
let's totally the first different. You go.
Yeah, those are totally different.
And then if you're not feeling great today, we'll keep it at 345 to 350. If you're feeling great, we'll see what happens, kind of thing. But the point is, you have to have a goal. And I like to prescribe goals of a workout. Like, this is not supposed to be a hard session, or it's not supposed to be all out kind of thing. So, but these terms can be frustrating for some, especially if they don't know what you mean. So it goes back to what I said earlier: is clear communication and giving instructions that the athlete can relate to and understand well.
But it's it's simple but not hard, right? It's time, minutes, as you said, and then a verbal description of hard, medium, easy, like some.
Yeah. What do you mean? Yeah, exactly. And I think people often get caught up also in paces, because they need to know what pace. Well, it depends. Like pace, to me, pace is an outcome unless it's a specific thing that you're looking for, right? Like on the track, if you're doing 200s and you're trying to achieve a certain thing with a specific athlete, you might give them tighter paces. But if you're doing a session that's meant to basically increase aerobic sort of capacity, that depends on the day, honestly. Like same thing with like thresholds. People use heart rates for threshold, which I agree with, unless that day heart rate is crazy high for whatever reason, then it doesn't quite work. So, you have to be able to adapt. Like someone said, my tempo pace is 5-minute pace per mile. I'm like, every day?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
How do you know? How does that, so it's about understanding how to adapt the paces,
Yep.
And how to adapt the based on effort. So that's the thing. Like if you prescribe effort, the pace will change, which is fine, unless you're trying to hit a specific pace. But sometimes you know what, today you need to suck it up. We're going to push through these and get the paces down. But other days, like, look, it's early season or it's late season. Either, it's the extremes where you have a lot more range, in my opinion. In the middle, you can all right, let's get some work done today. It's going to suck. You're supposed to be tired at this time, and let's push through it, kind of thing. But you have to be able to adapt that, and that's when the knowledge of, physiology, biomechanics comes into play.
Yeah, the micro dissection of intensity ranges, whether you're doing it by pace or by heart rate or power on the bike, it's just gotten out of control. And I keep coming back to the sentiment that your body is not that precise.
It's not exactly.
It's not close. So if you're telling me that your cyclist in 220 watts is your zone 3x1 threshold, whatever you want to call it, or 155 beats per minute is your anaerobic threshold. It's not like that every day. There's a myriad of things that can affect that, and your body is just not quite that precise to give it that level of that level of scrutiny from an intensity perspective.
Exactly. And anyone who believes that the human body is predictable is missing the mark, you know?
Yeah. Back to my Barada example earlier, where you've got 9 months of training laid out for you. It's like, really, does it really ever go to the plan like that? Come on.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So we're gonna leave athletes with keep it simple, prescribe things by time and effort, right?
Yeah.
Or more
at least
by
monitor
time.
using effort. You can prescribe using verbal instructions that then give a range of efforts, right? Because to me, saying today I want you to run a 3 out of 10, like that's almost worse than saying 8:32 pace. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
You know, because like, oh, I feel really bad. Like, how do you even gauge that? How do you even gauge it? Okay, well, this is a 4. Okay, I'm gonna slow down. Okay, this is a 3. Oh, this is a 2. I gotta go faster. You know, so it's hard to, you know, but you know, you might say a 2 to 5 effort kind of thing. You know, not above 5 or something. You know, but again, that's that specific instructions and communication with the athlete needs to be clear off the get-go.
Yep. And as you know, as a coach, and I'll profess to this as well, there's no substitute for good communication. It should always always start with that. How did you feel? How did the workout go? Not what was your heart rate for this?
Yeah. What's your pace? What's your heart rate? Yeah. I mean, that's going to be stressful.
100%. Cool.
You know? Yeah. Awesome.
So Max, where can people learn more about your work? I'll link in the show notes to all the papers that we referenced, but where can they interact with you and learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think like a lot of academics and sports scientists, I think Twitter is a good platform for that. I think there's some good, solid exchanges on there and a lot of dissemination of information. So that's probably the best way. And my tag is at Biomechanist. So just, pretty straightforward. And I think there's a lot of good discussions on there.
Isn't it awesome how that has unfolded?
Yeah, I mean, it's cool. I mean, I was reluctant to join Twitter or at least spend time on Twitter. And sometimes like, okay, enough Twitter. Like I need to just, you know, get off the Twitter and do something else. But, you know, I think it's really sort of bridged the gap between, I think, especially in the sports sciences, maybe not in like biochemistry or, you know, genetics, but in a field like sports science and exercise science and biomechanics, where a lot of the work is applied that relates directly to, you know, athletes and coaches, it's really bridged the gap between these two areas, and it really opens up lines of communication, even with clinicians. I think that's really been useful.
I 100% agree with that, because whenever you can bridge like I said earlier, it's rare that you have coaches that are also like legitimate sports scientists and do research and produce commentary and things like that. So the fact that there are not that many people who do that, if you have a medium that connects all of those people, it's just so valuable. I mean, I can remember, you know, way before Twitter even existed, and we got physical journal articles, we would have our interns go and like copy off the, you know, the relevant discussion points for the month from whatever journal, and then we'd get on a conference call with people, you know, and it was just, and that was great. There were a lot of awesome things that happened because of that way of disseminating information and then trying to communicate and learn from it. But the biggest thing is we were always like 1 year behind. You know, it just took so long to get all that together, and now it could be really instant, which is cool.
So yeah, it certainly has done that, you know, and luckily journals are moving away from the print versions, and it's mostly just all online now, luckily, and but I think, and also a lot of people are disseminating information via, you know, these, you know, podcasts and infographics and things. So I certainly urge any sports scientists listening or people that are involved in sports scientists to agree to do podcasts and infographics and contribute, because nowadays, I mean, that's the way to share things, you know?
100%.
Yeah.
All right, man. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
No problem. Yeah.
You guys go check out Max. He's a good Twitter follow for sure. I've learned a lot from following you and seeing, you know, kind of what you produce on that platform, both on the journal side of it and then also on the social side of it.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason.
And there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Max for coming on the podcast today. Really appreciate your time and your expertise. I learned a lot with that. I hope you guys did too by listening. If you think that your training is better served by weeding through some of these complicated variables of training load and training volume, and you want somebody to help you make sense out of that, we have a coach that is right for you. Our team of ultramarathon coaches is unparalleled in the industry, and we are always taking on new athletes that have audacious goals. So if you're interested in that, hit me up on social media, or you can go and see any of our training packages at trainright.com. As always, thank you guys for listening. Appreciate the heck out of each and every one of you, and we will see you out on the trails.